In the middle of the 19th century, economics was struggling with a quiet but fundamental problem. Prices moved, markets shifted, wages rose and fell. Yet the dominant theories of the time explained value as if it were something fixed, embedded in labor, locked into production, or anchored in cost. This mismatch between theory and reality sat uneasily beneath the surface of industrial Britain, where railways compressed distance, factories multiplied output, and urban populations grew faster than anyone could comfortably explain. Into this moment stepped William Stanley Jevons, a polymath by temperament and a reformer by instinct. Trained in chemistry, mathematics, logic, and statistics, Jevons did not approach economics as a tradition to be preserved, but as a problem to be solved. He believed that political economy had stalled because it relied too heavily on verbal reasoning and historical narrative, and not enough on measurement, formal structure, and psychological realism. At the heart of his dissatisfaction was the classical theory of value. Economists like Ricardo had argued that the value of goods was determined primarily by the labor required to produce them. This framework worked tolerably well when comparing goods produced under similar conditions, but it struggled to explain obvious, everyday phenomena. Why did diamonds command vastly higher prices than water, despite water being essential to life, and diamonds serving mostly ornamental purposes? Why did prices fluctuate even when production methods remained unchanged? Why did scarcity seem to matter more than effort? Jevons argued that the error lay in treating value as something objective and intrinsic. Value, he insisted, did not reside in goods themselves. It arose in the relationship between goods and human wants. This move, subtle in phrasing but radical in implication, shifted economics away from production and toward perception, choice, and use. He framed the issue starkly. Economics, at its core, is about human behavior under conditions of scarcity. People do not value goods because of how much labor they contain, but because of the satisfaction those goods provide. And crucially, that satisfaction is not constant. It changes with quantity. This insight led Jevons to a concept that would redefine economic theory: marginal utility. The usefulness of a good, he argued, diminishes as one acquires more of it. The first unit satisfies the most urgent want. Each additional unit serves a less pressing need. Value, therefore, is determined not by total usefulness, but by the usefulness of the last, or marginal, unit consumed. Water, abundant in most contexts, has low marginal utility, even though its total utility is enormous. Diamonds, scarce and non-essential, have high marginal utility precisely because additional units are rare and highly desired. Prices, in Jevons's view, reflect this marginal evaluation, not some historical ledger of labor hours. This way of thinking reversed the traditional causal chain. Classical economics began with production and derived prices from costs. Jevons began with consumption and derived prices from subjective valuation. Production still mattered, but only insofar as it affected scarcity and availability, which in turn shaped marginal utility. What made Jevons's approach especially distinctive was his insistence that economics should be mathematical. Human feelings might be subjective, he acknowledged, but their patterns were not random. If pleasure and pain guided decision-making, then economics could be modeled as a calculus of utility, constrained by resources and shaped by diminishing returns. He openly compared economic reasoning to physics, where forces balance and systems settle into equilibrium. This was not an attempt to strip economics of humanity, but to discipline it. Jevons believed that without formal structure, economists would continue to talk past the realities of markets. By grounding value in marginal utility, he provided a framework capable of explaining prices, exchange, and distribution in a unified way. Segment 1, then, establishes the central tension that defines Jevons's contribution: a world in rapid economic motion confronting theories built for slower times. His response was not incremental adjustment, but conceptual replacement. Value would no longer be anchored in the past, labor already expended, but in the present moment of choice, where individuals weigh satisfaction against scarcity. From this starting point, the modern theory of economics begins to take shape. Having broken with the classical idea that value is embedded in production, William Stanley Jevons faced a more delicate challenge: how to define and measure utility itself. If value arose from satisfaction, then economics could no longer avoid the inner world of human experience: pleasure, pain, desire, and restraint. What Jevons attempted was not to reduce these experiences to crude numbers, but to show that they followed regular patterns that could be analyzed systematically. Jevons defined utility as the capacity of a good to produce pleasure or prevent pain. Importantly, utility was not a moral concept for him. It did not imply goodness, virtue, or social benefit. It was simply a description of how individuals respond to outcomes. A harmful substance could have utility if it provided pleasure. A beneficial service could have low utility if it was unwanted. Economics, in Jevons's view, was not a guide to what people should value, but a study of how they do value. This distinction allowed him to treat utility as a neutral analytical tool. People act to maximize pleasure and minimize pain, given their constraints. From this premise, choice becomes intelligible. When individuals face alternatives, they compare expected utilities and select the option that yields the greatest net satisfaction. This process, repeated across millions of decisions, generates market demand. Crucially, Jevons emphasized that utility is not additive in a simple way. The total pleasure derived from consuming a good is less important than how pleasure changes with each additional unit. The first slice of bread to a hungry person provides immense utility. The second provides less. The 10th may provide almost none. At some point, additional consumption can even produce disutility, discomfort rather than satisfaction. This insight led directly to the principle of diminishing marginal utility. Jevons treated this not as a psychological curiosity, but as a foundational law of economics. Without diminishing marginal utility, demand curves would not slope downward. Prices would not adjust smoothly. Exchange itself would become difficult to explain. He went further, arguing that economic equilibrium emerges when individuals allocate their resources so that the marginal utility per unit of cost is equal across all uses. In plain terms, people stop shifting spending from one good to another when doing so no longer increases total satisfaction. This balancing process, invisible and decentralized, coordinates consumption without any central direction. What made this framework powerful was its symmetry. The same logic applied whether the decision involved bread, leisure, labor, or money. A worker chooses how many hours to work by comparing the marginal utility of income against the marginal disutility of effort and fatigue. A consumer chooses between goods by comparing the marginal satisfaction gained from each. Economics, in this sense, becomes a general theory of choice under constraint. Jevons's insistence on mathematical expression followed naturally. He believed that if utility varied continuously with quantity, then calculus provided the appropriate language. Marginal utility was not a metaphor, it was literally a derivative, the rate at which satisfaction changes as consumption increases. While he acknowledged that pleasure itself could not be measured with physical precision, he argued that relative comparisons were sufficient for economic analysis. This position drew criticism both then and later. Skeptics questioned whether subjective feelings could be meaningfully quantified at all. Jevons responded that economics did not require direct measurement of pleasure, only consistent behavior. If choices revealed preferences, and preferences followed regular patterns, then theory could proceed without peering into anyone's mind. Segment 2 solidifies the philosophical core of Jevons's economics. Value is subjective, utility is personal, and choice is governed by marginal comparison rather than total outcomes. By placing human sensation at the center of economic analysis, without moralizing it, Jevons transformed economics into a science of decision-making. From here, the implications extend outward, shaping theories of demand, exchange, and eventually distribution itself. With utility and choice firmly established, William Stanley Jevons turned to a question that had occupied economists since the earliest days of political economy. How does exchange actually occur, and why do markets settle at particular prices rather than others? For Jevons, the answer lay not in custom, authority, or historical accident, but in the balancing of marginal utilities between trading parties. Jevons approached exchange as a problem of mutual adjustment. When two individuals trade, each gives up something they value less in order to obtain something they value more. Exchange continues only so long as both sides gain utility. The moment further trade would reduce satisfaction for either party, exchange stops. This stopping point defines equilibrium. Rather than treating price as an external force imposed on buyers and sellers, Jevons treated it as the outcome of this balancing process. Price emerges where the marginal utility of what is given up equals the marginal utility of what is received, adjusted for quantity. In this sense, price is not arbitrary. It is the visible expression of invisible preferences interacting under scarcity. He illustrated this with simple barter models, not because he believed modern economies operated as pure barter, but because barter stripped exchange down to its essentials. In a two-good, two-person system, equilibrium is reached when the ratio at which one individual is willing to trade matches the ratio acceptable to the other. This ratio reflects each person's marginal utility schedule. Money in more complex economies simply generalizes this process by providing a common unit of account. From this framework, Jevons derived a condition that would become central to Neoclassical economics. Exchange is governed by the equality of marginal utilities at the margin of trade. In equilibrium, no participant can rearrange their trades to gain more satisfaction without reducing someone else's. This idea foreshadows later concepts of efficiency and optimality, even though Jevons himself did not formalize them in modern welfare terms. What distinguished Jevons's treatment of equilibrium was its dynamic character. Markets were not static objects but processes. Prices adjust as preferences change, supplies vary, and information spreads. Equilibrium is not a permanent resting place, but a moving target, a momentary balance in a constantly shifting system. This perspective aligned closely with the lived experience of industrial markets, where prices fluctuated daily and stability was temporary. Jevons also emphasized that equilibrium depended on knowledge. Individuals act on expectations, not certainties. If consumers misjudge the utility of a good, or producers misjudge demand, prices will initially be wrong, and adjustments will follow. Error is not an anomaly in markets, it is part of how markets learn. Through trial, loss, and revision, marginal valuations gradually align. Importantly, Jevons rejected the idea that markets required moral harmony or shared objectives to function. Exchange works precisely because individuals pursue their own satisfaction. Coordination arises not from agreement on ends, but from responsiveness to prices. This insight reinforced his broader claim that economics is descriptive, not prescriptive. It explains how order emerges, not how virtue should be enforced. By grounding exchange in marginal utility, Jevons also dissolved lingering confusions about fair price. There is no natural or just price embedded in goods. A price is fair if it reflects voluntary exchange under given conditions. If conditions change, scarcity increases, preferences shift, substitutes emerge, then prices change without implying injustice or exploitation by default. Segment 3 shows how Jevons extended marginal reasoning from individual choice to social interaction. Markets become systems of continuous negotiation, where equilibrium reflects the temporary alignment of countless marginal decisions. This framework replaces static cost-based explanations with a fluid, adaptive view of economic order, one that would soon become the backbone of modern price theory. Having reconstructed demand through marginal utility, William Stanley Jevons turned his attention to the other side of the market, labor, production, and cost. Here, his marginal framework again led him to challenge classical assumptions, particularly the idea that labor cost determines value. For Jevons, labor did not create value, rather, value justified labor. The classical view treated labor as an objective input whose quantity explained prices. Jevons inverted this logic. People supply labor because the income it generates provides utility, but labor itself is unpleasant. It involves effort, fatigue, and the sacrifice of leisure. He described this negative experience as disutility, a concept that mirrors utility but works in the opposite direction. From this perspective, labor supply becomes a problem of balance. A worker decides how much to work by comparing the marginal utility of additional income with the marginal disutility of additional effort. Early hours of work may feel tolerable or even satisfying, especially when income is low. As hours increase, fatigue grows, leisure is crowded out, and the disutility of further work rises. Eventually, a point is reached where the pain of working more outweighs the pleasure of earning more. That point defines the individual's labor supply. This reasoning allowed Jevons to explain why higher wages do not always lead to more labor. At low income levels, higher wages may induce workers to work longer hours since the marginal utility of income is high. At higher income levels, the same wage increase may lead to less work as individuals choose to buy leisure instead. This backward-bending logic, controversial at the time, highlighted the importance of subjective valuation even in production decisions. Jevons extended this reasoning to firms and costs. Costs were not fundamental determinants of price, they were themselves outcomes of marginal decisions. Producers expand output until the marginal disutility of additional production, whether measured in labor effort, resource strain, or opportunity cost, equals the marginal utility of expected revenue. Cost, in this sense, is a shadow cast by value, not its source. This was a radical departure from cost of production theories. Jevons did not deny that costs mattered, but he denied their explanatory primacy. Costs influence supply because they affect willingness to produce, just as prices influence demand because they affect willingness to consume. Both sides of the market are governed by marginal comparison. By framing labor as disutility rather than sacrifice imposed by necessity, Jevons also stripped economics of certain moral narratives. Wages were not compensation for suffering in an ethical sense. They were incentives that had to exceed the marginal unpleasantness of work. Exploitation within this framework could not be inferred simply from low wages. What mattered was whether exchange remained voluntary under prevailing conditions. This approach also clarified the role of technology. Improvements in machinery reduce the disutility of production by making effort more productive. As a result, supply can increase without increasing labor pain, shifting equilibrium prices downward. Technological progress, then, works through marginal adjustments, not through abstract productivity ratios alone. Segment 4 completes Jevons's reconstruction of the market mechanism. Demand is governed by diminishing marginal utility. Supply is governed by increasing marginal disutility. Prices emerge where these opposing forces balance. By applying the same marginal logic to both consumption and production, Jevons unified economics into a single framework of choice under constraint, one that replaced objective measures with subjective evaluation, without dissolving analytical rigor. With consumption, exchange, and labor recast in marginal terms, William Stanley Jevons extended his analysis to a deeper and more abstract problem: capital and time. Classical economists had treated capital largely as accumulated labor, machines, tools, and buildings embodying past effort. Jevons again reversed the direction of explanation. Capital mattered not because of labor already spent, but because of the future utility it made possible. For Jevons, capital is fundamentally about postponement. When resources are invested in machinery or infrastructure, they are withdrawn from immediate consumption in order to increase future satisfaction. This introduces time as a central economic variable. The key question becomes, how much present utility are individuals willing to sacrifice for greater utility later? This trade-off is governed by what Jevons called time preference, though he did not formalize it in the modern sense. People generally prefer satisfaction sooner rather than later, but this preference is not absolute. It depends on expectations, security, and the rate at which future utility is discounted. Saving, investment, and interest all arise from this inner temporal balancing. Interest, in Jevons's framework, is not exploitation of labor nor a mysterious surplus. It is the price paid to induce people to defer consumption. Just as wages compensate for the disutility of labor, interest compensates for the disutility of waiting. The marginal utility of present goods exceeds that of future goods, and interest equilibrates this difference. Jevons also emphasized that production is inherently time-structured. Goods are not produced instantaneously. They pass through stages: extraction, processing, assembly, transport, each requiring time and coordination. Capital lengthens the production process, but also increases its productivity. More roundabout methods, to use later terminology, can yield greater output, provided society is willing to wait. This insight subtly linked Jevons's work to later theories of capital, even though he did not fully develop them himself. What mattered was not the physical form of capital, but its role in reshaping the timing of utility. A machine is valuable because it allows future goods to be produced more efficiently, not because of the labor fossilized within it. Importantly, Jevons rejected the idea that longer production processes were always better. The optimal structure of production depends on marginal comparisons. If waiting longer yields only small additional utility, it may not justify the delay. Capital accumulation, like all economic activity, is constrained by diminishing returns at the margin. This marginal view of time also clarified economic instability. Overinvestment can occur when expectations about future utility are overly optimistic. If future demand fails to materialize, the utility promised by capital investments collapses, and losses follow. Cycles of boom and correction, in this light, are not moral failures but coordination errors across time. Segment 5 deepens Jevons's economic vision by extending marginal reasoning beyond the present moment. Economics becomes not just a study of choice among goods, but a study of choice across time. Capital, interest, and production structure are all expressions of how societies weigh present satisfaction against future possibility. This temporal dimension completes the transition from static cost-based theories to a dynamic, forward-looking economics grounded in human preference. As William Stanley Jevons pushed marginal analysis further, he confronted a practical obstacle that every economy faces: money. If value is subjective, fluctuating with marginal utility, how can a monetary system provide stability, calculation, and coordination? Jevons approached money not as a source of value, but as a measuring instrument, useful, necessary, and inherently imperfect. Jevons emphasized that money is not valuable because of its material substance, but because of its acceptability in exchange. Gold, silver, or paper function as money only insofar as people expect others to accept them. This made money a social convention anchored in trust, not an objective standard of value. Yet this convention allowed markets to operate on a vastly larger scale than barter ever could. Money, in Jevons's framework, serves three main roles: a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and a store of value. The first two are relatively stable functions. The third is problematic. Because utility changes over time, and because prices reflect marginal valuations, the purchasing power of money cannot remain constant. Stability, therefore, is an illusion created by habit and short time horizons. This insight led Jevons to a deep concern with monetary measurement. If money is used to compare values across time, wages today versus wages decades ago, prices now versus prices in the past, then changes in purchasing power distort perception. Apparent growth or decline may simply reflect monetary fluctuation rather than real changes in utility or production. To address this, Jevons advocated the use of index numbers, statistical averages of prices across many goods, to track changes in the value of money. While rudimentary by modern standards, this was a pioneering attempt to separate nominal change from real economic movement. He understood that no single price could represent value, but that patterns across many prices could reveal underlying trends. This concern was not academic. Britain in Jevons's time experienced significant price shifts due to gold discoveries, industrial expansion, and global trade. Without proper measurement, policymakers and businesses risked mistaking monetary effects for real prosperity or real decline. Jevons also recognized that money alters behavior. Because people think in monetary terms, they may treat money as if it had intrinsic value, forgetting that it merely represents command over goods. This can lead to hoarding, speculation, or panic when confidence falters. Monetary crises, in this view, are failures of expectation rather than failures of physical resources. Importantly, Jevons did not argue that money should be abolished or radically redesigned. His goal was clarity, not revolution. Economics needed better tools to interpret monetary signals, not grand moral judgments about finance. Money was a necessary abstraction, powerful, but dangerous when misunderstood. Segment 6 highlights Jevons's awareness of economics as a measurement problem. Subjective utility drives value, but objective systems require numbers. Money bridges this gap imperfectly. By exposing the limits of monetary stability, Jevons reinforced his central message: economic order emerges from human evaluation, not from fixed substances or eternal standards. Understanding that distinction is essential to interpreting prices, growth, and economic change. By the time William Stanley Jevons had reconstructed value, exchange, labor, capital, and money, he had arrived at a bold conclusion: economics could no longer remain a primarily literary or historical discipline. If economic phenomena arose from marginal changes in utility, disutility, and expectation, then mathematics was not optional. It was the natural language of the subject. Jevons argued that economic laws describe relationships between quantities, not narratives about institutions or moral ideals. When a small change in price produces a change in consumption, or when a small increase in wages alters labor supply, these are differential relationships. Calculus, which deals precisely with change at the margin, offered a way to express these relationships rigorously. This position placed Jevons at odds with many of his contemporaries. Classical economists had relied on verbal logic and broad principles, often resisting mathematical formalization as artificial or misleading. Jevons countered that imprecision was the greater danger. Without mathematics, economists could not clearly distinguish causes from effects or trace the consequences of incremental change. He did not claim that human behavior was mechanically predictable. Rather, he argued that large-scale regularities emerge from countless individual decisions. Just as physics does not predict the motion of individual molecules, but accurately describes gas behavior in aggregate, economics need not predict individual whims to explain market outcomes. Central to this mathematical vision was the marginal concept itself. Utility, disutility, cost, and satisfaction vary continuously with quantity. Economic equilibrium occurs where opposing marginal forces balance. Prices are not fixed points but solutions to systems of equations representing preferences, resources, and constraints. Jevons's mathematical ambition extended beyond theory. He believed that economics should become increasingly empirical, using data to estimate relationships and test hypotheses. Statistics, probability, and averages were essential tools for bridging theory and observation. His work on price indices and economic cycles reflected this commitment to measurement. At the same time, Jevons was aware of the limits of formalism. He acknowledged that utility could not be directly measured in absolute units. Mathematics, therefore, had to work with relative comparisons and functional relationships rather than precise magnitudes. This humility distinguished his approach from later, more mechanistic interpretations of neoclassical economics. Critics accused Jevons of reducing human life to equations. In response, he insisted that mathematics did not eliminate meaning, it disciplined reasoning. By clarifying assumptions and making implications explicit, mathematical models exposed hidden contradictions and sharpened debate. Segment 7 captures Jevons's vision of economics as a science of relationships rather than doctrines. His embrace of mathematics was not an aesthetic preference, but a methodological necessity rooted in marginal reasoning. This shift would profoundly influence later economists, setting the stage for formal demand theory, general equilibrium analysis, and the quantitative turn that defines modern economics. By the late 19th century, it became clear that William Stanley Jevons was not working in isolation. Almost simultaneously, similar ideas about marginal utility were emerging on the European continent, most notably through Karl Menger in Austria and Léon Walras in Switzerland. Together, though independently, these thinkers initiated what would later be called the Marginal Revolution, a decisive break from classical political economy. Jevons's contribution to this revolution was distinctive in tone and method. Where Menger emphasized causal explanation and subjective valuation without heavy mathematics, and Walras pursued fully articulated systems of simultaneous equations, Jevons stood between them. He combined psychological insight with mathematical structure, insisting that economics must rest on both human sensation and formal reasoning. What unified these approaches was a shared rejection of labor as the determinant of value. Value now flowed from marginal evaluation, not historical cost. This shift resolved long-standing paradoxes that classical economics had struggled to explain and provided a common language for analyzing demand, supply, and price formation. Jevons, however, was particularly explicit about the direction of causality. Prices do not arise because goods are costly to produce. Goods are produced because expected prices justify the effort. This inversion became a cornerstone of neoclassical economics. Production decisions follow valuation, not the other way around. Another important aspect of Jevons's role in the marginal revolution was his insistence on continuity. Economic change, in his view, happens incrementally. Large disruptions, crises, booms, collapses are the cumulative result of many small misalignments, not sudden breaks in economic law. This emphasis reinforced the marginal approach and discouraged explanations based on abrupt structural ruptures alone. Despite these contributions, Jevons did not fully systematize his theory into a complete general equilibrium framework. That task would fall to later economists. His work was exploratory, foundational, and occasionally incomplete. But this openness allowed his ideas to be adapted, extended, and formalized by others. Importantly, Jevons did not frame the marginal revolution as ideological warfare against classical economists. He saw himself as correcting and completing their work, not overthrowing it. Ricardo and Mill had identified important regularities. They had simply misunderstood the mechanism beneath them. Segment 8 situates Jevons within a broader intellectual transformation. Marginalism was not a single doctrine but a new way of seeing economic life, one focused on choice, scarcity, and incremental adjustment. Jevons's blend of psychology, mathematics, and empirical concern made him one of its most influential architects, even if his legacy would later be overshadowed by more formal systems built on his foundations. As influential as William Stanley Jevons became, his economic framework was never without critics, and many of the most important critiques targeted the very foundations that made his work revolutionary. Marginal utility explained prices with remarkable clarity, but it also raised difficult questions about measurement, realism, and social interpretation that economics has never fully resolved. The most persistent criticism concerned utility itself. Jevons treated utility as a continuous, comparable magnitude, at least in relative terms. Critics argued that while individuals can rank preferences, they cannot meaningfully quantify differences in satisfaction. Is the pleasure from one good twice that of another? Is the pain of 1 hour of labor equal across individuals? Without clear answers, some argued that marginal utility rested on an unobservable psychological construct. Jevons anticipated this objection and partially disarmed it. Economics, he argued, does not require direct measurement of pleasure, only consistent choice. Preferences are revealed through behavior. If people repeatedly choose one option over another under similar conditions, that choice provides sufficient evidence of relative utility. Still, this defense left unresolved the problem of interpersonal comparison. Marginal utility works well within a single decision-maker's framework, but struggles when comparing welfare across individuals or groups. This limitation had important implications for distribution. Jevons's theory explained how prices and wages emerge, but it said little about whether those outcomes were socially desirable. If wages reflect the marginal productivity and disutility of labor, then inequality appears as a neutral outcome of preference and scarcity rather than a moral problem. Critics later argued that this neutrality concealed power relations, institutional constraints, and historical asymmetries that shape choice itself. Another critique focused on equilibrium. Jevons treated markets as systems that tend toward balance through marginal adjustment. While he acknowledged error and miscalculation, he generally assumed that corrective forces would operate smoothly. Later economists, especially those studying crises and instability, questioned whether markets actually converge so reliably or whether disequilibrium is a persistent condition rather than a temporary deviation. There was also tension between Jevons's mathematical ambition and the complexity of real economies. Simplified models clarify logic, but they risk abstracting away institutional detail, laws, norms, contracts, and political power that influence economic outcomes. Jevons believed these factors mattered, but he treated them as secondary to the universal logic of marginal choice. Critics argued that this hierarchy understated the role of social structure. Perhaps the deepest unresolved issue was normative silence. Jevons deliberately stripped economics of ethical judgment, framing it as a science of means rather than ends. This methodological restraint gave economics analytical power, but it also created a vacuum. If economics explains how outcomes arise, but not how they should be evaluated, where does responsibility lie? With policymakers? With moral philosophy? With society at large? Segment 9 reveals Jevons not as a finished system builder, but as a foundational thinker whose ideas opened as many questions as they answered. Marginal utility clarified price formation and choice, but it also narrowed the scope of economic explanation in ways that continue to provoke debate. The power of Jevons's framework lies precisely in this tension between clarity and incompleteness, precision and abstraction. When William Stanley Jevons died in 1882, at just 46 years old, his work was still controversial, incomplete, and far from fully absorbed into mainstream economics. Yet over time, the conceptual shift he helped initiate reshaped the discipline so thoroughly that many of his ideas became invisible, embedded so deeply in economic reasoning that they now appear self-evident. The most enduring element of Jevons's legacy is the marginal perspective itself. Modern demand theory, consumer choice models, labor supply analysis, and price theory all rest on the idea that decisions are made at the margin. Economists no longer ask whether goods are useful in total, but how usefulness changes with quantity. This single shift altered how scarcity, substitution, and opportunity cost are understood. Jevons's insistence that value is subjective also transformed economics' relationship to psychology. While later economists would distance themselves from explicit psychological language, the core assumption that preferences guide choice remains central. Even highly abstract models of rational behavior trace their lineage to Jevons's claim that economics begins with human evaluation rather than physical inputs. His influence is equally visible in methodology. The use of mathematics to express economic relationships, once controversial, is now standard. Equilibrium analysis, comparative statics, and optimization techniques all reflect Jevons's belief that economics is a science of functional relationships shaped by marginal change. Although later theorists formalized these tools more rigorously, the intellectual permission to do so owes much to him. At the same time, Jevons's work foreshadowed debates that continue today. Questions about the measurability of utility, the realism of equilibrium, and the ethical neutrality of economic analysis remain unresolved. Behavioral economics, institutional economics, and welfare theory can all be seen as responses, direct or indirect, to the boundaries Jevons helped define. Perhaps most importantly, Jevons altered how economists think about causality. Production does not dictate value. Value motivates production. Prices are not historical records of effort, but real-time signals reflecting marginal judgments. Markets are not mechanical systems, but adaptive processes coordinating dispersed knowledge through choice. For an InSlowSpective lens, Jevons represents a quiet turning point rather than a dramatic rupture. There was no manifesto, no political movement, no immediate consensus. Instead, a new way of seeing slowly displaced the old. By shifting attention from totals to increments, from labor to choice, and from static costs to dynamic evaluation, Jevons helped move economics from industrial age into the modern analytical era. Segment 10 closes the arcade of Jevons's contribution not with finality, but with continuity. His theories did not answer every question, nor were they meant to. They provided a framework, precise, flexible, and incomplete, within which future economists would argue, refine, and occasionally rebel. In that sense, William Stanley Jevons did not merely contribute to economics, he changed the way economics thinks.